Every time you worry, you believe you're taking care of yourself. You're just rehearsing the pain before it arrives. People spend decades convinced that mentally reviewing the worst-case scenario is a sophisticated form of protection, almost a psychological amulet against chaos. But Carl Jung understood something darker than that. The human mind does not worry in order to avoid suffering. It worries in order to keep alive the illusion that it still has control over what was never in its hands. And while that illusion is active, you pay an invisible tax, your peace, for a debt that never existed. There is a cruel mechanism inside the human psyche. It convinces you that feeling anticipatory fear is a sign of responsibility, that losing sleep over what could go wrong is a form of being prepared. But observe with cold detachment what worry actually produces. It doesn't prevent accidents. It doesn't pay bills. It doesn't change other people's decisions. It doesn't alter diagnoses. It only ages you on the inside while facts run their own course, indifferent. The real prison, the one no one notices, was never in the problems that arrive. Though it's in the fictional problems you build, decorate and visit every night like someone visiting an imaginary cemetery. And there you weep for deaths no one died. Pay attention to this with the distance of a clinical observer. Worry is never about the future. It's about the inability to tolerate the uncertainty of the present. You don't fear tomorrow. You fear the emptiness that exists right now, inside you, when there's nothing to control. And you fill that void by fabricating threats. That is not care. It's an addiction, a silent addiction, socially accepted, praised as maturity, but which slowly corrodes your ability to exist in peace. And this is where depth psychology starts to become uncomfortable. You don't worry because things are serious. You worry because inside you, calmness has become unbearable. And then we arrive at the second mechanism, even more unsettling. Worry, when repeated for years, ceases to be a thought and becomes an internal chemical dependency. The brain reacts to imagined scenarios exactly as it would react to real danger. The heart races, the stomach clenches, the shoulders lock, the breath shortens. And yet, nothing happened. Nothing except a mental scene. This is what Jung would call unconscious possession. A buried part of your psyche begins to govern your body while you believe you're merely thinking. You are not thinking. You are being thought by something you have not yet been able to integrate. And the most perverse part is that this anxiety gives a false sense of action. You feel productive while ruminating. You feel you're solving something when you're only spinning. It's the same motion as someone pedaling a stationary bike. Lots of effort, lots of sweat, and no actual displacement. Rumination is the stationary bike of the soul. It tires you without taking you anywhere. And after years of this motion, the body collapses. Insomnia, gastritis, chronic tension, exhaustion with no apparent cause. Not because life became too heavy, but because you learned to carry a weight that never needed to exist. And you carried it for so long that you came to believe that weight was you. That's why I created the Código do Despertar for you. It's not a motivational course. It's not a collection of pretty quotes to stick on your wall. It's an inner map built on Carl Jung's psychology for those who have already realized that constant worry isn't lucidity. It's a sophisticated mask of imprisonment. 60 days of daily lessons with specific keys, questions that sting in the right place, and declarations that reorganize your inner world. You read, you carry out that day's micro-action, and you record what stirred inside you. Step by step, you stop being managed by anxiety and begin walking toward individuation, the process of finally becoming who you always were beneath the masks. The access is in the first pinned comment of this video. If something inside you recognized this truth, write in the comments, "I'm ready to let go." That small gesture is the first psychological contract you sign with yourself. And you need to separate two things that almost everyone confuses. There is planning, and there is fearing disguised as planning. They are not the same thing. Planning has an end. You define a problem, examine the variables, decide on an action, and close the thought. The mind rests because the task has been completed. Worry, on the other hand, is a thought that refuses to end. It returns to the same point, repeats the same scenario, revisits the same doubt like a dog chasing its own tail. It's not analysis, it's repetition. And repetition without action is the hallmark of fear dressed up as intelligence. Have you noticed how people who worry too much rarely solve the problems they worry about? They spin them, pollute them, inflate them, but rarely face them. That's not laziness, it's a refined defense mechanism. As long as you're worried, you have the feeling of doing something. And that feeling eases the guilt of not acting. That's why worry is so addictive. It offers the moral comfort of action without the real risk of action. You exhaust yourself as if you were working, but nothing changes in the external world. Only your inner wear and tear changes, and over time, you begin to confuse that wear and tear with effort. You start to believe that being destroyed inside is a sign that you're trying. You're not. You're just spinning inside a cage built by your own thoughts. The psychologically mature adult has a very specific, almost silent inner phrase. What I can do now, I do. What I can't, I let go. Simple as that. Cold as that. There's no drama, no aesthetic rumination, no ritual of suffering beforehand to deserve peace afterward. He acts when he can act and releases when there's nothing to be done. Most people, however, do the opposite. They suffer before they need to suffer during what's already suffering, and keep suffering after the problem has passed, mentally reliving the episode. That's not sensitivity. It's conditioning, and conditioning can be undone. Here, deep psychology asks a question that hurts. Why can't you let go? The answer is harsh, because you built an identity around anxiety, and abandoning worry for many people feels like losing a piece of yourself. At some point in your story, you learned that worrying means caring, that being constantly on alert means being responsible, that sleeping poorly over others means loving deeply, that carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders means being someone trustworthy. And once those equations took hold, calm became betrayal. You started to feel guilty when you were well. You started to distrust lightness. You started to sabotage yourself as soon as peace appeared, because peace didn't match the image you have of yourself. This is what Jung would call identification with a mask, the persona. And the persona here is that of the permanent vigilante, the person who needs to carry everything, the one who cannot fail, the one who must anticipate everything so nobody suffers. Beneath this persona, there is almost always a child who learned too early that they were only loved when they were useful, who only received attention when they were solving things, who only had value when they were sacrificing themselves. And that child grew up confusing love with overload, grew up associating rest with abandonment, grew up believing that existing without worry was existing without purpose. That's why letting go hurts, because letting go means demolishing an identity that was built for you to be accepted, and demolishing an identity is always a small morning. But the exhaustion you feel after a whole day worrying about people, projects, and possibilities is not physical fatigue. It's the exhaustion of performing a hyper-vigilant version of yourself to keep others comfortable and to keep your own image intact. It's the exhaustion of a mask that got too big, a mask that became armor, and the armor became a prison. And the scariest thing about this prison is that the door has been open for years. You're the one who no longer believes you can leave. And what you buried to fit into that mask, your spontaneity, your lightness, your right not to be available all the time, didn't die. Buried things never die. They just leak. In the form of anxiety, in the form of inexplicable irritation, in the form of that tightness in your chest that appears out of nowhere when you finally sit down to rest. And it is precisely at this point that the code of awakening enters as a surgical tool, not as comfort, as a scalpel. Each of the 60 lessons was designed to dismantle this anxious identity in layers, without hurry, without violence, but without anesthesia. Access is in the first pinned comment. If you made it this far, it's because a part of you already understands that continuing like this costs too much. Don't let this realization cool down. It is rare. Now imagine, just for a moment, what happens inside you when the worry stops. Not when the problems disappear, that will never happen. But when the worry, that background mental noise, goes silent, the first thing that returns is energy. An energy that was hijacked every day to feed scenarios that didn't exist. You start to truly sleep. Food regains its flavor. Conversations regain their depth, because half your mind is no longer somewhere else, rehearsing catastrophes. The second thing that returns is perception. You start to notice things that were there for years. The light of an afternoon, the tone of voice of someone who loves you, details of decisions that needed to be made and that you couldn't see because you were distracted by the internal noise. And the third thing, the most interesting, is discernment. You begin to distinguish with surgical clarity what is a real threat and what is noise. Your reading of the world sharpens. You stop reacting to everything with the same intensity, and you start to see, with a serene coldness, which people truly deserve your attention, which projects deserve your energy, which decisions deserve your weight. Opportunities don't appear out of nowhere. They were already there. It's just that now, without the filter of fear, you can finally see them. Life doesn't change. You are the one who becomes present for it. And existing present is the closest a human being comes to being free. But none of this happens as long as you demand a guarantee from the universe. Here is the most uncomfortable truth of this whole conversation. You will never have absolute control over what comes. Never. Not because the world is cruel, but because that is the architecture of existence. And excessive worry, at bottom, is a childish attempt to renegotiate that clause in the contract. It's the mind stomping its foot, demanding predictability in a system that never promised to be predictable. And the result of this demand is suffering. A useless, continuous, self-inflicted suffering disguised as responsibility. What Jung would call individuation begins exactly where this demand ends. It begins the moment you look inward and admit, with a rare kind of honesty, I don't know what's coming. And even so, I trust my ability to face whatever comes. Not because you are sure of winning, but because you have already survived things you swore you couldn't bear. And each of those survivals, if you look calmly, has built inside you a kind of silent nucleus, a center that is not easily shaken. People mistake this center for strength. It's not strength, it's intimacy with oneself. It's knowing in your bones that there is someone reliable on the inside. And this trust, when it finally settles, dissolves the need for worry, because worry was always a symptom of distrust in oneself. And this is one of the harshest inversions that depth psychology offers. You don't worry because life is dangerous. You worry because deep down, you don't believe you are capable. You don't trust how you will respond. You don't trust who you will be under pressure. And to compensate for this distrust, you try to control the external world. But the problem was never out there. It was, as it always is, in your relationship with yourself. Rebuilding this trust is not motivational. It is structural. It requires facing day after day the small situations that arise, acting with what you have, reaping the result without drama, and observing, almost clinically, that you survived again, and again, and again, until a sober peace begins to occupy the place where panic used to live. But none of this happens if you keep inhabiting the only place where worry is possible, the imaginary future. The greatest loss caused by chronic anxiety is not sleep, not health, not energy. It is the present. It is your own life happening while you are somewhere else, mentally, reliving an event that may never occur. You didn't lose these years to problems. You lost these years to fictitious problems. And no one gives back time. No therapy, no book, no spiritual awakening gives back the birthday parties where you were present in body and absent in soul. No reunion gives back the conversations where you were miles away mentally from the person in front of you. This is the price that no one puts on the bill, the real life that passed while you lived inside your head. The ancient wisdom, and Jung recognized this very clearly, is an almost technical skill, recognizing what is under your control, acting on it with precision, and letting go of the rest. Not as resignation, as strategy. You don't let go because you gave up. You let go because you understood that holding on changes nothing except destroying you. And this surrender is not weakness. It is the highest form of emotional intelligence. It is the inner adult, finally formed, telling the inner child that it can rest, that it no longer needs to watch over the entire world to feel safe, that now there is someone inside taking care, and that someone is you. And it is precisely about this reconstruction that the Code of Awakening was architected. 60 days, one lesson per day, one key, one question, and one declaration, followed by a micro-action and a journal entry. It is not fast. It is not magical. It is precise. Each day demolishes with a scalpel a layer of the anxious structure you have spent decades building. The access is in the first pinned comment. And if you are still postponing, understand that postponing is not neutral. Every day you keep this old identity alive is one less day of real life. The choice remains yours. But the illusion that you have infinite time to choose is precisely one of the traps of the worried mind. And so we arrive at the paradox that closes everything. People think that if they stop worrying, they will become cold, distracted, negligent. It is the opposite. When you stop worrying excessively, you do not become indifferent. You become, for the first time, truly effective. Because action without fear is clean action. It is action that sees the situation as it is, and not as panic would have it be. Your decisions become more precise. Your conversations become deeper, because you are fully present in them. Your relationships become more real, because you are no longer projecting threats into every silence of others. And the strangest thing? Things start to go right, not because the universe has begun to cooperate, but because you stopped sabotaging every opportunity with the filter of fear. That is the inner silence that the ancients called wisdom. It is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of someone inside you who no longer feels threatened by them. It is the end of that constant feeling that something terrible is about to happen. It is the discovery that calm was never a luxury. It was always your natural state, merely kidnapped for decades by a mind trained to survive and never to live. You can close this video now and return tomorrow to the same cycle. Wake up tired before you even begin. Mentally rehearse scenarios that may never arrive. Lose another day inside your own head while real life happens on the outside. You can keep honoring this anxious old identity as if it were who you are, or you can accept with the coldness that truth demands that this identity was never you. It was merely a survival strategy that stayed in charge for too long. The guide is in the first pinned comment. The choice is not between acting now or acting later. The choice is between continuing to be managed by fear or finally beginning to exist. The illusion is over. Decide.